In the harsh desert of Dust Creek, Arizona Territory, an 18-year-old cowboy, barely surviving on odd jobs and sleeping in a stable, stumbles upon a confused old man wandering alone by the roadside. Everyone passes him by, ranchers, townsfolk, even the local deputy, but this young cowboy doesn't hesitate. He takes the old man's hand and leads him on a dangerous 15-mile journey through Red Rock Pass to get him home safely, even though it means losing the only paying work he had that week. What he doesn't know is that this frail, lost soul is William Garrett, father of the governor of the Arizona Territory, and what happens next will not only change his life forever, but will reshape the future of every forgotten soul in the West. The sun hung low over Dust Creek like a copper coin, pressed against the horizon, casting long shadows across the dirt roads and wooden storefronts that made up the small Arizona town. It was the kind of evening where the heat of the day finally broke and people emerged from their homes and businesses, eager to finish their errands before nightfall settled in completely. Jesse Tucker wiped the sweat from his brow with a torn bandana, his hands still trembling slightly from the weight of the hay bales he'd been moving all afternoon. At 18 years old, his frame was lean and sun-darkened, his clothes patched in more places than not, and his boots so worn that the sole of the left one flapped loose with every step. He'd been working at Miller's livery stable for nearly 6 months now, ever since his father had died in a cave-in at the Copper Ridge mine, leaving Jesse with nothing but a tattered bedroll and his father's old hat. The work at the stable wasn't much, mucking stalls, feeding horses, repairing tack, but it came with a place to sleep in the hayloft and occasionally a hot meal if Hank Miller was feeling generous. Most nights, Jesse went to bed with his stomach only half full, but he never complained. Complaining didn't put food on the table or a roof over your head, and in a town like Dust Creek, you either worked or you starved. That evening, Jesse had one more job to complete before the day was done. A rancher named McAllister needed a horse delivered to his property on the far edge of town by sundown, and he'd promised Jesse $2 silver for the task, enough to buy a week's worth of beans and bread, and maybe even pay Hank the rent he owed for the loft. If Jesse didn't make it in time, McAllister had made it clear he wouldn't pay a cent, and Hank had already warned him that morning, "You're 3 weeks behind, boy. Either you settle up tonight, or you find somewhere else to sleep." Jesse secured the horse's reins and was about to mount when something caught his eye near the edge of the main road. An old man stood there just beyond the hitching post outside the general store, his posture bent and uncertain. He wore a dusty gray coat that hung loose on his thin frame, a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better days, and his silver hair poked out in wild tufts from beneath it. His weathered hands clutched a walking stick, and he turned slowly in place, looking at each building, each person, as though searching for something he couldn't quite name. Jesse watched as a group of townsfolk walked right past him, a merchant with his arms full of crates, 2 women in bonnets chatting animatedly, a young boy chasing a dog. None of them so much as glanced in the old man's direction. Even Deputy Clayton, who was leaning against the saloon post smoking a cigarette, looked straight through him as though he were invisible. The old man took a few shuffling steps toward the edge of town, then stopped, confused. He mumbled something Jesse couldn't hear, then turned back around, his eyes scanning the horizon with a kind of quiet desperation that made Jesse's chest tighten. Jesse glanced at the sun. It was sinking fast. If he delayed even 10 minutes, he'd miss the deadline. McAllister wouldn't pay. Hank wouldn't let him stay. He'd be sleeping under the stars tonight, and in Arizona Territory, the nights could be as cruel as the days were hot. But then the old man stumbled slightly, catching himself on his walking stick, and Jesse saw something that made him forget about the time entirely. A flicker of fear in the man's eyes, the kind that spoke of someone who didn't know where they were or how to get home. Jesse hesitated for only a moment. Then, with a quiet sigh, he tied the horse back to the post, adjusted his father's hat on his head, and walked toward the old man. Some choices, he'd learned, weighed heavier than silver dollars. Jesse approached slowly, not wanting to startle the old man, his boots crunching softly against the dirt road. Up close, he could see the confusion etched deeply into the weathered lines of the man's face, the way his eyes darted from building to building, as if the entire town had been rearranged while he wasn't looking. "Excuse me, sir," Jesse said gently, removing his hat out of respect. "Are you all right?" The old man turned toward him, blinking slowly, as though Jesse's voice had come from very far away. For a moment he said nothing, just studied Jesse's face with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. Then finally he spoke, his voice thin and wavering like wind through dry grass. I was trying to find my way home," he said, glancing down at his own hands as if they might hold the answer. "But I can't seem to remember which road it is. Was it the North Trail, or perhaps past the church?" He paused, his brow furrowing. "There used to be a church, didn't there?" Jesse glanced around. There was a church in Dust Creek, but it was small and set back from the main road. He wasn't sure that's what the old man meant. "Where do you live, sir? Maybe I can help you get there." The old man's lips parted, but no answer came. He looked down at the walking stick in his hands, then up at the sky, then back at Jesse, his expression clouding over with something close to panic. I don't, it's a big house, white columns, I think, or maybe they're stone. My son lives there. He's important, very important." Jesse's heart sank a little. The man was clearly lost, and not just in terms of direction. His mind seemed to be slipping in and out like smoke through a fence. Jesse looked around, hoping someone else might step in, someone with more authority or knowledge of the area. But the townsfolk continued on their way, and Deputy Clayton had already disappeared into the saloon. Jesse knelt slightly to meet the old man's gaze. "Do you have anything on you? A letter, maybe? Something with an address?" The old man patted his coat pockets absently, then pulled out a few items: a folded handkerchief, a dented pocket watch with a cracked face, and a small brass compass that no longer pointed north. But no papers, no identification. Jesse was about to suggest they head to the sheriff's office when something glinted in the fading sunlight. A silver chain hung around the old man's neck, disappearing beneath his collar. "May I?" Jesse asked, gesturing gently. The old man nodded, confused but trusting. Jesse carefully pulled the chain forward, revealing an engraved silver locket. He opened it with a soft click. Inside was a faded photograph of a younger version of the old man standing beside a stern-looking woman, and on the opposite side, engraved in small, elegant script, were the words, "William Garrett, Garrett Ranch, 15 miles north of Dust Creek." Jesse's breath caught. Garrett Ranch. He knew the name. Everyone in the territory did. It was one of the largest properties in Arizona, a sprawling estate that had belonged to the Garrett family for decades. And if this man was William Garrett, that meant he was the father of Governor Thomas Garrett himself. Jesse looked up at the old man, William, and saw only confusion and exhaustion in his eyes. He had no idea who he was, or how far from home he'd wandered. 15 miles. That was nearly 3 hours on horseback, longer on foot, and the sun was already beginning to dip below the mesas. If Jesse took him now, he'd miss McAllister's deadline entirely. He'd lose the $2 silver. He'd lose his room. He'd lose his bed for the night, maybe longer. But as he looked into William's eyes that held a quiet, childlike trust, simply because Jesse had stopped to ask if he was all right, Jesse knew there was no other choice. He gently took the old man's arm. "Come on, Mr. Garrett. Let's get you home." Jesse led William back to the hitching post where the horse still waited, its tail swishing lazily at the evening flies. He untied the reins and helped the old man climb up into the saddle, steadying him with both hands as William gripped the saddle horn with trembling fingers. The old man was lighter than Jesse expected, his frame brittle beneath the dusty coat, and for a moment Jesse wondered how long he'd been wandering alone out there. "Hold on tight, Mr. Garrett," Jesse said softly, adjusting the stirrups so William's feet wouldn't slip. "We've got a ways to go, but we'll take it slow." William nodded absently, his gaze drifting toward the horizon, as if he were looking for something just beyond reach. Jesse swung up behind him, wrapping one arm carefully around the old man's waist to keep him steady, and with a gentle nudge of his heels, they started north out of town. The road that led to Garrett Ranch was not an easy one. It wound through open desert first, where the ground was hard-packed and dotted with sagebrush and scattered stones, then climbed steadily into the foothills where the terrain grew rougher and the shadows deeper. The path cut through Red Rock Pass, a narrow stretch flanked by towering red cliffs that glowed like embers in the dying light. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way, but it was also dangerous, especially after dark. Jesse had made the journey once before, years ago, when his father had taken him to deliver a repaired saddle to a ranch hand who worked at the Garrett estate. He remembered the way the wind howled through the pass, the way the rocks seemed to shift and groan, as if the land itself were alive. He'd been younger then, and his father had been with him. Now he was alone, carrying a man who didn't know his own name. They rode in silence for the first hour, the only sounds the steady clop of the horse's hooves and the occasional call of a distant coyote. William swayed slightly in the saddle, and Jesse tightened his grip, murmuring reassurances whenever the old man seemed startled by a shadow or a sudden gust of wind. "Where are we going?" William asked at one point, his voice soft and uncertain. "Home," Jesse replied simply. "We're taking you home." William was quiet for a moment, then said, "I had a son once. A good boy, smart. He wanted to help people." He paused, his breath catching. "Do you know him?" Jesse hesitated. He didn't know the governor personally, no one like him did, but he'd heard the name spoken with a mixture of respect and fear throughout the territory. Thomas Garrett was known as a fair man, but also a powerful one, the kind who could change lives with a single signature. "I'm sure he's waiting for you," Jesse said gently. William smiled faintly, though his eyes remained distant. "He worries too much, always has." As they climbed higher into the pass, the temperature dropped, and Jesse could feel the old man beginning to shiver. Without thinking, Jesse pulled off his own worn jacket and draped it over William's shoulders, even though it left him in nothing but a thin cotton shirt that did little against the cold. "You'll freeze," William murmured, half aware. "I'll manage," Jesse said, though his teeth were already beginning to chatter. They paused once at a small creek that trickled down from the rocks, and Jesse helped William dismount so he could drink and rest. The old man sat on a flat stone, staring at the water as if it held answers he couldn't quite grasp. Jesse filled his canteen and offered it to William, who drank slowly, then handed it back with a quiet "thank you" that sounded almost like a prayer. By the time they remounted and continued on, the stars had begun to appear overhead, scattered like silver dust across the darkening sky. Jesse's legs ached, his hands were numb from gripping the reins, and his stomach growled with hunger. But he kept going, one steady step at a time, because turning back now was unthinkable. Some journeys, he realized, weren't measured in miles. They were measured in the weight of a promise made without words. It was nearly 10 o'clock when the gates of Garrett Ranch finally came into view, rising out of the darkness like the entrance to another world. 2 tall stone pillars flanked the entrance, topped with iron lanterns that flickered weakly in the night wind, and beyond them stretched a long dirt road lined with cottonwood trees that led toward a sprawling white house set against the base of the hills. Jesse had never seen anything quite like it. Even in the dim light, he could make out the grand columns that framed the front porch, the multiple wings that stretched out on either side, and the soft glow of lamplight coming from several windows. It was the kind of place that belonged in a painting, not out here in the rugged Arizona desert. He guided the horse through the gates and up the long drive, his exhaustion pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. William had dozed off against his chest somewhere in the last mile, his breathing shallow but steady, and Jesse had been too afraid to wake him. Now, as they approached the house, Jesse could see movement on the porch, figures emerging from the front door, lanterns raised high. "Who's there?" a woman's voice called out, sharp with alarm. Jesse cleared his throat, his voice hoarse. "My name's Jesse Tucker, ma'am. I've brought Mr. William Garrett home." There was a moment of stunned silence, and then the woman, middle-aged, wearing a dark dress and white apron, gasped and rushed down the steps. "Mr. William! Oh, dear Lord, where has he been?" She turned back toward the house and shouted, "Martha, get the governor, quickly!" Jesse carefully dismounted, his legs nearly buckling beneath him, and reached up to help William down. The old man stirred, blinking slowly as if waking from a deep dream. "Are we home?" he asked, his voice small and confused. "Yes, sir," Jesse said gently. "You're home." The woman, who Jesse assumed was one of the housekeepers, took William's arm and guided him toward the porch, murmuring soft reassurances. Jesse stood by the horse, unsure of what to do next, his body swaying slightly from exhaustion. He'd done what he came to do. Now he just needed to get back before... Wait! The voice came from the doorway, deep and commanding. Jesse looked up to see a tall man stepping out onto the porch, his dark suit impeccable even at this late hour, his face shadowed but unmistakably sharp with authority. Governor Thomas Garrett. He descended the steps quickly, his eyes fixed on William, and when he reached him, he took the old man's face gently in his hands. "Father," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "where have you been? We've had men searching for you since this afternoon." William blinked up at him, a faint smile crossing his lips. "Thomas? I went for a walk, I think. Or maybe I was looking for something." He trailed off, his confusion returning. The governor exhaled shakily, then pulled his father into a careful embrace. For a moment, the powerful man who governed the territory looked like nothing more than a frightened son. When he finally pulled back, he turned his gaze to Jesse, who was still standing awkwardly by the horse, holding the reins. "You brought him home," the governor said, his voice quiet but steady. Jesse nodded. "Yes, sir. Found him wandering in Dust Creek. He had your family name on a locket, so I figured." 15 miles, the governor said, his eyes scanning Jesse's worn clothes, his thin frame, the jacket that was now draped over William's shoulders. "You rode 15 miles through Red Rock Pass in the dark." Jesse shifted uncomfortably. "It was the right thing to do, sir." Thomas Garrett studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he stepped forward and extended his hand. "What's your name, son?" "Jesse Tucker, sir." The governor's grip was firm, deliberate. "Thank you, Jesse Tucker." "You've brought my father back to me." He paused, then added, "Please, come inside. Warm yourself. Let us give you a proper meal and a ride back to town." But Jesse shook his head, exhaustion pulling at every word. "That's kind of you, sir, but I should be getting back. It's late, and I've got work in the morning." He didn't mention that he no longer had a place to sleep. That detail seemed too small to burden these people with. The governor's brow furrowed, clearly unconvinced. But before he could protest further, Jesse tipped his hat politely and turned back toward the horse. His legs felt like lead, his hands were still numb from the cold, and every muscle in his body screamed for rest. But he'd already delayed long enough. The longer he stayed, the harder it would be to face what waited for him back in Dust Creek. "At least take this," the governor said, reaching into his coat pocket and producing several folded bills. "For your trouble." Jesse paused, his hand on the saddle, and looked back. The money would solve everything, his rent, his meals, maybe even enough to get ahead for once. But something in him recoiled at the thought. He hadn't done this for payment. He'd done it because an old man had been lost and afraid, and nobody else had stopped. "I appreciate it, sir, truly," Jesse said carefully, But I didn't help your father for money. I just wanted him to be safe." He swung up onto the horse, wincing as his sore muscles protested. "You take care of him now." Before the governor could respond, Jesse turned the horse and started back down the long drive, the sound of hooves echoing softly in the night. Behind him, he could hear muffled voices, the governor speaking urgently to one of the staff, Martha's worried tones. But he didn't look back. He just kept riding, the darkness swallowing him whole as he passed through the gates and back onto the open road. The journey back to Dust Creek felt longer somehow, lonelier. Without William's weight in the saddle, without the purpose that had driven him forward, Jesse felt the full weight of his exhaustion settling in. The cold bit deeper now, and his empty stomach twisted painfully, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since a stale biscuit that morning. By the time he reached the edge of town, the moon had climbed high overhead, casting pale silver light across the shuttered storefronts and empty streets. Miller's livery was dark except for a single lantern hanging by the door, and as Jesse approached, he saw exactly what he'd feared, a heavy padlock on the hayloft entrance, and his bedroll tossed unceremoniously onto the dirt outside. Hank had made good on his warning. Jesse dismounted slowly, returning the horse to its stall and making sure it had water and feed before dealing with his own situation. Then he gathered up his bedroll, his few belongings stuffed inside, and stood there in the cold night air, trying to decide what to do next. The Dusty Trail Saloon would still be open, but he had no money for a room. The church might offer shelter, but Father Michael's was strict about only housing families or women in need. That left the alleys, the spaces beneath porches, or if he was lucky, an abandoned shed on the outskirts of town. Jesse chose a spot behind the general store, where the wind was partially blocked by stacked crates and the overhang provided some protection from the elements. He unrolled his bedding, lay down on the hard ground, and pulled his father's hat low over his eyes. The earth was cold beneath him, and he could hear rats skittering somewhere in the darkness, but he was too tired to care. As he lay there, staring up at the stars through the gaps in the wooden slats above, he thought about William Garrett's face when they'd arrived at the ranch, the way confusion had melted into something like peace. He thought about the governor's hand on his father's shoulder, the relief and love plain even in that brief moment. Jesse had lost his own father to the mines, had never gotten the chance to bring him home or say a proper goodbye. But tonight he'd given that gift to someone else, and somehow, despite the cold and the hunger and the uncertainty of where he'd sleep tomorrow, that felt like enough. He closed his eyes, exhaustion finally overtaking him, and drifted into a restless sleep filled with dreams of long roads and distant houses glowing like lanterns in the dark. What he didn't know was that miles away, in the grand study of Garrett Ranch, the governor was writing a letter by lamplight, and the next morning would bring something Jesse Tucker never could have imagined. Jesse woke to the sound of wagon wheels crunching over dirt and the low murmur of voices nearby. He blinked against the harsh morning light, his body stiff and aching from the cold ground, and for a moment couldn't remember where he was. Then it all came rushing back, the long ride, the locked hayloft, the bedroll behind the general store. He sat up slowly, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and peered around the edge of the crates. Out front, a polished black carriage had stopped in the middle of the street, drawn by two fine horses that looked wildly out of place in dusty Dust Creek. A driver in a formal coat sat at the reins, and standing beside the carriage, speaking with a bewildered-looking Hank Miller, was a woman Jesse recognized from the night before, Martha, the Garrett housekeeper. "I'm telling you he works here," Martha was saying, her tone polite but insistent. A young man, 18 or so, thin build, brown hair, goes by Jesse Tucker. Hank scratched his beard, looking uncomfortable. "Well, he did work here, but I had to let him go last night. Couldn't pay his rent. Don't know where he went after that." Jesse's heart sank. He didn't want to be found like this, sleeping rough, jobless, looking like exactly what he was, someone with nothing. But before he could retreat further into the shadows, Martha's sharp eyes caught movement near the crates, and she turned. "There," she said, pointing directly at him. "That's him." Jesse had no choice but to stand, brushing dirt and straw from his clothes as he stepped out into the open. He tried to summon some dignity, straightening his shoulders and meeting Martha's gaze. "Morning, ma'am." Martha's expression softened immediately. She took in his appearance. The worn clothes, the bedroll clutched in one hand, the exhaustion still etched into his young face, and something like sadness crossed her features. "Mr. Tucker," she said gently, "the governor sent me to find you. He'd like to speak with you if you're willing." Jesse hesitated. "I appreciate that, ma'am, but I've got to find work today. Can't afford to—" "He's offering you work," Martha interrupted, her voice kind but firm. "And more than that, please, just come with me." Jesse glanced at Hank, who was watching the exchange with growing curiosity, then back at the fine carriage. Part of him wanted to refuse, to maintain whatever shred of pride he had left, but another part, the part that had gone to bed hungry and woken up sore, knew that turning down this opportunity would be foolish. He nodded slowly. "All right." The ride back to Garrett Ranch felt surreal in the daylight. Jesse sat inside the carriage across from Martha, who made polite conversation about the weather and the condition of the roads, carefully avoiding any mention of where she'd found him that morning. Through the window, Jesse watched the desert landscape roll by, the same path he'd ridden in darkness, now revealed in shades of gold and rust under the climbing sun. When they arrived, the estate looked even grander than he remembered. In the daylight he could see the manicured gardens, the whitewashed fences, the stable that was larger than most houses in Dust Creek. A few ranch hands paused in their work to watch the carriage pass, and Jesse felt suddenly, acutely aware of how out of place he was. Martha led him not to the main entrance, but around to a side door that opened into a comfortable sitting room. "Wait here," she said softly. "The governor will be with you shortly." Jesse stood awkwardly in the center of the room, afraid to sit on the fine furniture with his dusty clothes. The walls were lined with books, the floor covered in thick rugs, and everything smelled of pipe tobacco and polished wood. Through the window, he could see William Garrett sitting in the garden, wrapped in a blanket, watching birds flit between the trees. Footsteps approached from the hallway, steady and purposeful, and then Governor Thomas Garrett entered the room. He was dressed more casually than the night before, but his presence was no less commanding. His eyes found Jesse immediately, and for a long moment, the two simply looked at each other. Then the governor spoke, his voice quiet but certain. "Jesse Tucker, I owe you a conversation." The governor gestured toward one of the leather chairs near the window. "Please sit." Jesse hesitated, glancing down at his dusty clothes, but the governor's expression left no room for argument. He sat carefully on the edge of the seat, his hat resting on his knees, while Thomas Garrett took the chair opposite him, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, not the posture of a politician, but of a man speaking from the heart. "My father has been struggling for some time," the governor began, his voice measured but heavy with emotion. "His mind, it comes and goes. Some days he's sharp as ever, remembering details from 40 years ago. Other days he doesn't know where he is or who I am." He paused, his jaw tightening. "Yesterday was one of the bad days. He slipped out while the staff was occupied, and by the time we realized he was gone, he could have been anywhere." Jesse listened quietly, his hands gripping his hat. "We had men searching the roads, the nearby ranches, even sent word to the sheriff's office in town," Thomas continued. "But it was you, a stranger with no obligation, no connection to our family, who found him, who stopped when everyone else just walked by." His eyes locked onto Jesse's. "Martha told me where she found you this morning, sleeping behind the general store." Jesse's face flushed with embarrassment, but he held the governor's gaze. You lost your lodging because you chose to help my father, Thomas said. You gave up work, wages, shelter, everything you had to make sure an old man got home safely. He leaned back slightly, his expression softening. That tells me more about your character than any letter of recommendation ever could. Jesse swallowed hard. I just did what anyone should have done, sir. But they didn't, the governor said firmly. That's the point. They didn't. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at his father in the garden. I've spent years in public service, Jesse. I've met hundreds of men, politicians, businessmen, soldiers. Most of them talk about honor and duty, but when it comes down to it, they make the choice that benefits them most. He turned back. You didn't, and that's rare. There was a long silence, filled only by the distant sound of William humming a tune in the garden. I'd like to offer you something, Thomas said finally. Not as payment. I know you refused money last night, but as an opportunity. He walked to his desk and picked up a piece of paper, then returned and handed it to Jesse. A position here at the ranch, room and board, fair wages, and if you're interested, I can arrange for you to continue your education. There's a school in Santa Fe that— Governor, Jesse interrupted gently, his voice uncertain. That's more than generous, sir. But I don't want you to feel like you owe me something just because I helped your father. That's not why I did it. Thomas Garrett smiled, not the practiced smile of a politician, but something genuine and warm. I know that, son. That's exactly why I'm asking. He gestured toward the window. My father doesn't have many good days left. I know that. But when he does have them, when his mind is clear, I want him to be surrounded by people who see him as a person, not just as someone to be managed or pitied. His voice grew quieter. You saw him that way. Even when he was confused and lost, you treated him with dignity. Jesse looked down at the paper in his hands. It was a simple contract, handwritten in neat script, outlining a position as a ranch hand with living quarters in the staff house, 3 meals a day, and a wage that was more than he'd made in 6 months at the livery. You don't have to decide right now, Thomas said. Take the day. Think about it, but know this. If you accept, you won't just be working for me. You'll be giving my father something precious in the time he has left, companionship from someone who genuinely cares. Jesse looked up, his throat tight. Through the window, he could see William turning to wave at a butterfly that had landed on the arm of his chair, his face lit with childlike wonder. I don't need the day, sir, Jesse said quietly. I'd be honored to stay. The months that followed changed Jesse Tucker's life in ways he never could have imagined, not through grand gestures or sudden wealth, but through the quiet accumulation of small, meaningful moments that built into something resembling a home. He was given a modest room in the staff quarters, clean, warm, with a real bed and a window that looked out over the eastern hills. The work was honest, tending horses, mending fences, helping maintain the vast property. But more than that, he was given something he hadn't had since his father died: purpose, and people who saw him not as a burden or a charity case, but as someone who belonged. William Garrett took to Jesse immediately. On his good days, the old man would sit on the porch and tell stories about the early days of the territory, about building the ranch with his own hands, about his late wife and the dreams they'd shared. Jesse would listen for hours, asking questions, laughing at the old jokes, and gently steering the conversation when William's memory began to falter. On the bad days, when William didn't recognize where he was or called Jesse by his son's name, Jesse simply sat with him, patient and kind, holding the old man's hand until the confusion passed. He never corrected him harshly, never showed frustration. He just stayed. Governor Garrett noticed. He noticed the way his father's face lit up when Jesse entered a room. He noticed how much calmer William had become, how the restless wandering had stopped. And he noticed something else. Jesse reminded him of what leadership actually meant. Not power or position, but showing up for people when it mattered most. One evening, as they sat together on the porch after William had gone to bed, Thomas turned to Jesse with a thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you did for my father, and about all the others out there like him, people who slip through the cracks because they're old, or poor, or forgotten." Jesse listened quietly as the governor continued. "There are young people too," Thomas said. "Orphans, drifters, kids working themselves to the bone just to survive like you were." He paused. "What if we could do something about that, something lasting?" Over the following weeks, they worked together on a plan. Governor Garrett would establish a territorial program, funded partially by his family's estate and partially by public resources, to provide support for the elderly who had no one to care for them, and to create opportunities for young people who had potential but no path forward. They called it the Crossroads Initiative, named for the idea that everyone, at some point, reaches a moment where they need someone to stop and help them choose the right direction. Jesse helped design the first shelter in Dust Creek, a modest building that offered temporary housing, meals, and job placement assistance. He met with other young workers, listened to their stories, and advocated for programs that would give them the same chance he'd been given. Not charity, but opportunity. Not pity, but respect. The governor used his position to push the initiative through the territorial legislature, and within a year, similar programs had sprouted in 3 other towns. Jesse became the face of the effort, traveling to speak with communities, sharing his own story not for acclaim, but to show others that change was possible. And through it all, he never forgot where it started, with an old man standing lost by the side of the road and the simple decision to stop. William Garrett passed peacefully 2 years later in his sleep, with his son holding one hand and Jesse holding the other. At the funeral, Governor Garrett spoke about his father's legacy, not the wealth or the land, but the kindness he'd shown to strangers and the example he'd set for those who knew him. And as Jesse stood among the mourners, hat in hand, he thought about that cold night when he'd given up everything to make sure one confused old man got home safely. He thought about how a single act of compassion had rippled outward, changing not just his life, but the lives of hundreds of others across the territory. Because sometimes the most important journey isn't measured in miles traveled or destinations reached. It's measured in the moments when we choose to stop, to see someone else's struggle, and to walk beside them, even when the road is long, the night is cold, and no one else is watching.